Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack the sources you share and give you the shortcut to understanding the most critical issues of our time. Today, we are wrestling with a threat that is absolutely foundational to the digital world: securing the software supply chain, that entire trust pipeline.
It really is. I mean, it's arguably the defining security challenge for modern businesses. And this is way more complex than just, worrying about your internal firewalls. It's about guaranteeing the integrity of everything. Every single artifact, every dependency, every build environment.
From the very first line of code.
Right. From the moment a developer commits code, all the way until that binary hits production. The sources we looked at are crystal clear on this. The integrity of the code is paramount. It directly maps to the integrity of the business.
And the pipeline itself, the process of building and deploying software, that's become the weak spot.
Fundamentally, yes, it's the weakest link that keeps getting exposed in these major global attacks we keep seeing.
Okay, so our mission today is pretty straightforward then. We need to really dissect the nature of the problem. How do these vulnerable dependencies, these unsecured environments, how do they actually lead to these catastrophic compromises?
Exactly. We need to understand the how.
But then, more importantly, we have to pivot to the solution. We need to examine the cryptographic bedrock, the architectural foundations needed to actually restore trust in that pipeline.
Yeah, moving from just analyzing the chaos of these infiltrations.
To understanding the mathematical certainty required to actually stop them.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this right away. When most people think security, their mind probably jumps to, I don't know, firewalls failing, maybe fishy emails, that kind of visible stuff.
Sure, the perimeter defenses.
Right. But the source material forces us to confront a much deeper, maybe less obvious truth right from the start. The vast majority of security problems, they're actually caused by bad software.
That's the uncomfortable reality. Flaws introduced, often unintentionally, during the development cycle itself.
Which kind of flips things, doesn't it? It makes software development itself the cutting edge, the front line of modern security research.
It absolutely does. And what's fascinating here, and the sources touch on this, is this tension between two kind of competing ideas in system security.
Okay.
Well, on one hand, you have the principle of securing the weakest link. You know, the old adage, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Makes sense. If one part breaks, the whole thing fails.
Exactly. So if you have one component, maybe an open source library pulled in quickly without much checking, and it lacks basic security, the whole system becomes vulnerable right there.
But then security folks always talk about defense in depth.
Yeah.
Layers of security.
Right. And that's the other side of the coin. Defense in depth argues that the system's total protection can actually be greater than its single weakest component if you have overlapping redundancies.
Okay, so multiple layers might catch something that gets past the first one.
That's the goal. But here's the catch with the software supply chain. If you rely on a single unverified component, maybe something that needs high privileges to run, and you haven't properly vetted it, well, you've just created a single point of failure that can potentially bypass all your other fancy layers.
So if that one critical piece is malicious or flawed,
your redundancy doesn't matter much at that point. If the source of truth itself, the code, is poisoned, then your defense in depth is basically built on quicksand.
and these flawed components, they often contain vulnerabilities that are, frankly, ancient history in software terms, right? Especially languages like C and C++. I'm thinking buffer overflows.
Oh, yes. The classic. Buffer overflows, and specifically the technique called stack smashing, are fundamentally about memory misuse. A program allocates a fixed amount of memory, a buffer, to hold some data, like user input.
Okay.
Now, if an attacker can trick the program into writing more data into that buffer than it was designed to hold,
It spills over.
it spills over, exactly, like overfilling a cup. That excess data overwrites adjacent memory locations.
It's like stuffing too many files into a folder, and they start crushing the folders next to them.
That's a great analogy. And critically, what's often sitting right next to that buffer in memory on the program stack? The return address.
The return address, that tells the program where to go back to after a function finishes.
Precisely. So if the attacker carefully crafts their overflowing input, they can overwrite that return address with an address they choose.
So instead of going back to the normal program flow,
The program jumps to the attacker's address, and usually the attacker has also managed to inject their own malicious code, often called shell code, onto the stack as part of that overflow. So the program jumps right into the attacker's code.
and the goal of that shell code is usually, what? Getting control.
Typically, yes. To gain an interactive shell, basically a command prompt, this gives the attacker control over the system, often running with the same permissions as the program they just compromised.
Which could be high privileges.
Which could be very high privileges. This is why memory safety issues like buffer overflows are so critical and why they're still exploited. And you often find these flaws lurking in third-party libraries.
Maybe they weren't built with the same security rigor.
Sometimes, yes, or they're older code bases. It becomes one of the easiest ways to inject malicious code into a system that might otherwise seem well protected by network firewalls. You bypass the perimeter by poisoning the software itself.
So if bad code is the root problem, the obvious, maybe naive solution is just check all the code, audit everything.
If only.
Given the sheer number of dependencies in any modern application, hundreds and maybe thousands, that sounds completely impossible, right? Where's the practical line drawn between manual review and automated security tools?
That is a huge challenge. The sources do confirm that deep, manual code auditing by a skilled human is often the best way to find novel, previously unknown vulnerabilities. It's 0 days.
A human can understand context and logic in a way an automated tool might miss.
Exactly, but you hit the nail on the head. For a complex application pulling in hundreds of external libraries, frameworks, components, we're talking potentially millions, even tens of millions of lines of code. Manual inspection of everything is just not feasible, not even close.
So the focus has to shift then. If we can't audit the logic of everything,
we have to verify the provenance. Where did this code come from? Has it been tampered with since it left the trusted source?
Okay.
The very fact that we can't inspect everything forces us to rely on trust. And that means we absolutely must verify the integrity and the origin of the components we use. And this, fundamentally, is why the pipeline itself, the whole environment where code is built, tested, packaged, deployed, has become such a prime target for attackers.
And we see that reflected in the stats about why cyber incidents happen, right? It's not always just smash and grab.
Not at all. The statistics are pretty stark. The majority of major cyber incidents are linked to espionage, stealing information, long-term access, that's over half, around 52%. And then disruption campaigns are another big chunk, about 35%.
So getting in quietly is usually the first step before causing damage or stealing secrets.
Infiltration is the precursor to degradation or exfiltration, yes. Attackers want persistent, unnoticed access, which means our threat modeling, how we think about securing this pipeline, has to rigorously defend against two main vectors within the supply chain itself.
Which are?
First, insider risk. That could be a malicious employee deliberately tampering with code or build processes, or maybe just a careless one making a mistake that opens a door.
Okay, the internal threat.
And second, external Trojan horse attacks. This is where seemingly legitimate software, maybe an update to a tool everyone uses, is compromised before it even gets to you. The attacker poisons the source. Think about compromising the update server for a popular developer tool, for instance.
Wow, that completely flips the idea of trusted software on its head, doesn't it? The trust itself becomes the attack vector. To really grasp the scale of this threat, looking at history helps. This pattern of compromising one weak point to get the keys to the kingdom, it's not new. Let's start with an early but really foundational example. Solar Sunrise, back in 1998.
Yes, Solar Sunrise. It's a textbook case, really, illustrating how stealing credentials can lead to deep, persistent access within what should be a secure environment, like a deployment environment. The attackers managed to intrude into multiple U.S. military sites, National Guard, Air Force bases. But crucially, they didn't just bang on the front door of those military networks directly.
They found a side entrance, right, through a trusted connection.
Exactly. They first exploited a known vulnerability on a computer server at MIT. That MIT server, which presumably had some trusted access or connection to the military networks, became their supply chain entry point. It was the compromised component.
Once they had that initial foothold inside, what was the next move?
Textbook espionage, really. Their main goal was to steal keys and credentials to move further. They installed a packet sniffer.
A tool to just listen to network traffic?
Right. A program designed to capture data flowing across the network. And back then, a lot more traffic was unencrypted. This simple tool allowed them to harvest usernames and passwords that were being sent in the clear,
giving them legitimate credentials to use.
Exactly. And with those credentials, they could move laterally, explore the network, basically roam around the entire environment, including potentially sensitive build and deployment areas, looking like legitimate users.
And the final step, making the access permanent.
The critical step for a persistent supply chain compromise. They created a backdoor. a hidden way for them to get back into the network whenever they wanted, even if the initial vulnerability was fixed. Solar Sunrise really showed the devastating long-term danger of compromising a build or deployment environment and, crucially, stealing the secrets, the credentials within it.
That feels like a maybe cruder, early version of the very precise component-level attacks we see now.
Right.
Attacks like Stuxnet seem almost surgical in comparison.
Stuxnet is absolutely the poster child for modern, sophisticated surgical supply chain operations. And the most critical takeaway from Stuxnet, the one that's really relevant to our discussion about trust, is often missed. People focus on the malware itself, but
Did more than just the malware.
it relied fundamentally on a deep, critical compromise of digital trust. Yes, the operation was complex, targeting very specific industrial control system centrifuges in an Iranian nuclear facility.
I remember reading about manipulating the power supplies first.
That's right, yeah. One of the sophisticated initial vectors involved compromising the uninterruptible power supplies, the UPS devices, to potentially manipulate voltage and physically damage the centrifuges. But the truly devastating supply chain element, the part about trust, was how the malware actually got onto and ran undetected on the target Windows systems controlling those centrifuges.
It had to look legitimate to the operating system, right, to avoid alarms.
It had to look perfectly legitimate, and it did, because the malicious Stuxnet drivers were digitally signed using stolen, legitimate private signing keys.
Stolen keys, not fake ones.
Real, valid private keys belonging to two completely uninvolved, legitimate hardware companies in Taiwan Realtek and J-Micron. The attackers didn't necessarily compromise the target's code initially. They compromised the system of trust that Windows uses to verify code authenticity.
They stole the keys to the trust mechanism itself.
Exactly. They stole the private signing certificates from these third-party component manufacturers who were part of the broader supply chain. This allowed their malicious code to appear completely authentic to Windows, bypassing security checks and allowing deep infiltration into those critical control systems without immediate detection. That is the absolute definition of a catastrophic supply chain failure based on compromised trust.
Wow, that's profound. It really shows the target isn't always the code itself, but the cryptographic identity that vouches for the code.
Precisely. The signature matters as much as the bits. And if we broaden the lens again, we see how persistent, multi-pronged campaigns can leverage compromised information, not just for immediate access, but for wider goals, like the Russian campaigns targeting the DNC and RNC.
And that wasn't just one group acting alone, was it?
No, the forensic investigations indicated at least two distinct and apparently uncoordinated Russian intelligence-linked groups attacking the same targets around the same time. You had the Dukes, also known as Cozy Bear, or APT-29, and Fancy Bear, also known as APT-28.
Attacking the same political organizations simultaneously, but maybe not working together.
It seemed that way. An uncoordinated yet extremely persistent deep infiltration campaign targeting high-value political data.
And the goal here wasn't just controlling the networks. It was about using the stolen data, wasn't it?
Yeah, the objective seemed clearly tied to amplifying broader political influence operations and propaganda efforts, primarily by strategically leaking compromised data like campaign emails at times designed to maximize political damage and sow discord during an election cycle.
So the persistence, the fact multiple groups were involved, the goal of information exploitation.
It all underscores the need for defense against these complex, multi-pronged intrusions. They're not just about stealing data anymore, they're about weaponizing that data later. And the sheer scale and persistence of these attacks really forces us to recognize that human vigilance alone isn't enough. We have to move towards structural, cryptographic verification to have any hope of securing this chain.
Okay, this brings us right to the technical core of the solution, cryptography. If the entire process, the whole chain, is potentially vulnerable to tampering, the only way we can really restore trust is to mathematically prove two things. That nothing's been altered, and that the code genuinely comes from who we think it comes from.
Exactly. Proof, not just hope.
And the absolute first step in building that proof is the hash function.
Yes, one-way hash functions. They're the bedrock of modern integrity assurance. You might hear them called message digests, fingerprints, cryptographic checksums. They're all basically the same idea. What they do, fundamentally, is take an input of any size, it could be a tiny config file, the entire source code of an application, a massive compiled binary, we call this input the pre-image, and they crunch it down, mathematically, into a fixed-length output string, the hash value.
And the critical thing is the sensitivity, right? That so-called avalanche effect.
Absolutely critical. The sensitivity is extreme. If you change even a single bit in that massive input, flip one semicolon in a million lines of code, the resulting output hash changes radically, becomes completely different, almost unrecognizable.
Which makes them perfect for checking if something's been tampered with.
Perfect. If you download a piece of software, compute its hash, and compare it to the hash value provided by the trusted distributor, if they match, you have very high confidence that the code hasn't been altered, say, in transit or while sitting on a download server.
But like you said, not all hash functions are secure anymore. Attackers try to find collisions, right? Where two different inputs produce the same hash.
That's the main attack vector against hash functions. And the standards here for anyone building a secure supply chain are pretty much non-negotiable, according to the sources we reviewed. We absolutely need robust collision resistance.
Meaning it should be incredibly hard, practically impossible, for an attacker to find two different files that hash to the same value.
Computationally infeasible, yes. This is essential to defend against things like the birthday attack. That's a probabilistic attack where, given enough computing power, an attacker might be able to generate a malicious file that just by chance happens to share the same hash value as a legitimate, maybe already signed, benign file.
So if they can substitute their malicious file, the hash check would still pass.
Exactly, which is why the choice of algorithm matters hugely.
So what are the recommendations? What should people be using?
Well, the sources are clear. Nothing weaker than SHA-1 should even be considered for new applications. And honestly, even SHA-1 has known theoretical weaknesses, though practical collision attacks are still very difficult.
And older ones like MD5.
Absolutely not. MD4 and MD5 are considered completely broken. Practical collision attacks exist and are relatively easy to perform. They should never be used for security purposes anymore.
So aim higher, SHA-2 family.
Yes. For robust security, especially against those birthday attacks over the long term, you really need hash algorithms that produce larger outputs. We're talking message digest of at least 256 bits, like SHA-256, or even better, 512 bits, like SHA-384 or SHA-512. That makes the space of possible hashes astronomically large, making collisions infeasible for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so hashing gives us integrity proof the code hasn't changed. But we still need the other part. Identity. How do we guarantee the entity that created this code or signed off on it is actually the one we trust? That sounds like public key cryptography and digital signatures. Code signing.
That's exactly what it is. Public key cryptography, or asymmetric cryptography, was this brilliant mathematical invention that solved the huge key management problem you have with similar symmetric systems, where both sides need the same secret key. It relies on a pair of mathematically linked keys, a public key, which you can share widely with anyone. You can post it on your website, whatever it's used for encrypting messages to you or for verifying your signatures. And then there's the corresponding private key, which you must guard fiercely and keep absolutely secret. That's used for decrypting messages sent to you or, critically for our discussion, for creating digital signatures.
We often hear about the RSA algorithm in this context. I know it relies on the mathematical difficulty of factoring huge numbers, the product of two large primes, P and Q. But practically in a high-stakes environment like signing critical software, how do you actually protect that private key? It seems like the crown jewel.
It absolutely is the crown jewel, and protecting it is paramount. You don't just store it in a file on a developer's laptop. The standard non-negotiable practice is to use a hardware security module, or HSM.
A physical device?
Yes, a dedicated, tamper-resistant physical appliance. It's specifically designed to securely generate, store, and use cryptographic keys, especially private keys, without ever exposing the raw key material outside the HSM's secure boundary. The actual signing operation happens inside the HSM.
So the key never leaves the box.
Never leaves the secure hardware boundary. These HSMs are built to meet rigorous security standards, like FIPS 140-2 in the US. They are absolutely critical for maintaining the root of trust in any serious code signing or supply chain security setup. Because you're right, if that private signing key gets compromised, like happened with the certificates used by Stuxnet, then the entire system of trust collapses no matter how strong your hash function is. Game over.
Okay, so a developer, or more likely a build system, uses the private key secured in an HSM to create a digital signature for a piece of code. How does the verification work on the other end, say, during deployment?
So the system that's about to run the code, or the person downloading it, needs two things: the code itself and the signer's authentic public key. They first calculate the hash of the code they received. Then, using the public key, they run a verification algorithm on the digital signature provided. That signature isn't an encryption of the whole file, it's essentially a cryptographic proof based on the private key applied to the hash of the file. If the verification algorithm succeeds using the public key, and the calculated hash matches the hash embedded within or associated with the signature, the system knows two things. One, the code hasn't been altered since it was signed, integrity, thanks to the hash, and two, it was definitely signed by the owner of the corresponding private key, authenticity identity.
And this whole process, enforcing that verification check before running anything, that's the core idea behind binary authorization, isn't it?
Exactly. Binary authorization is essentially a policy enforcement mechanism. It says, I will only execute binaries or deploy configurations or run containers that carry a valid digital signature from a specific list of trusted authorities whose public keys I possess and trust. It moves from hoping things are okay to demanding cryptographic proof.
Now, this sounds great for maybe one piece of software, but how does this scale? Modern applications have hundreds, thousands of dependencies, constant updates. How do we manage this web of trust efficiently?
That's where the ecosystem is evolving rapidly. You can't just rely on individual signature checks in isolation anymore. The scale demands more transparency and automation. This is where technologies like transparency logs come into play, often associated with projects like Sigstore, which is gaining a lot of traction.
Transparency logs, like a public record.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Think of it like a secure, public, append-only cryptographic ledger. When an artifact, like a software package or container image, is signed, a record of that signing event is published to this public log. So now, when you go to verify the artifact, you don't just check the signature itself. You also check that the signing event is actually recorded in the public transparency log. This gives you extra assurance. It proves the signature existed at a certain point in time, it's publicly auditable, and it makes it much harder for an attacker to, say, compromise a signing key and secretly sign malicious software without anyone noticing, because the act of signing would ideally create a public, immutable record. It helps tackle the scale and complexity of managing trust across millions of components and constant updates.
That makes a lot of sense. It adds a layer of public accountability. Okay, so we have hashing for integrity, signatures for identity, transparency logs for scale and auditability. But even with all that, there's still the moment keys might be exchanged, maybe setting up a secure connection, if an attacker can intercept or manipulate that initial exchange.
Right, the problem of key transport and preventing replay attacks. Even if you're using strong public key crypto to establish a secure channel or exchange a session key, you need safeguards to ensure an attacker can't just record a valid encrypted message from a past session and simply replay it later to trick the system.
How do you stop that?
You need to introduce time variance or uniqueness into the protocol. This is typically done using nonces, which stands for number used once, basically just a random number unique to that session. Or you can use precise timestamps or sequence numbers that increment with each message.
So each message or session is unique.
Exactly. These random or time-sensitive elements are mixed into the cryptographic protocols. They guarantee that even if an adversary records an old encrypted message, they can't successfully replay it later because the nonce, timestamp, or sequence number will be wrong for the current context. The system will reject it. It's about layering the randomness of time or session uniqueness onto the mathematical certainty of the cryptography. #tag4. Defenses in the deployment pipeline?
All right, we've laid out the cryptographic foundation for building trust, hashing, signing, transparency logs. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about how these principles get operationalized and enforced within a modern deployment pipeline, like a CI/CD system. How do we move beyond just detecting a campered artifact towards actually preventing bad things from running?
Well, before we even get to runtime prevention or fancy pipeline controls, a truly secure supply chain has to start with something even more basic: knowing what's actually in your software in the first place. Inventory and transparency.
You mean knowing all the dependencies?
Precisely. This is where the concept of a software bill of materials, or SBOM, becomes absolutely essential.
An SBOM sounds like an ingredients list for code.
That's exactly what it is. It's a formal, ideally machine-readable inventory that lists all the components, libraries, modules, and dependencies, both direct and indirect, that are used to build a piece of software. It should include details like their exact versions, where they came from, and maybe even their license information.
And why is that so critical for defense?
Because visibility is the first step to control. If a major vulnerability is discovered tomorrow in, say, a widely used open source logging library, how do you quickly figure out which of your hundreds or thousands of applications are actually using that specific vulnerable version?
Without an SBOM, it would be a nightmare. Manual searching, guesswork.
A total nightmare. It could take weeks, months even, to find all instances. But with an accurate, up-to-date SBOM for every application, you can programmatically query them instantly. Show me all products using library X version Y. Response time drops from winks to potentially minutes. It's fundamental for rapid vulnerability response. You can't secure your supply chain if you don't even know what supplies are in it. You need the SBOM before you can even properly decide what needs signing or what policies to apply.
Okay, so step 1. Know your ingredients with an SBOM. Once we have that visibility, then we can look at enforcing some basic defenses, maybe at the operating system or compiler level, to mitigate those really old, low-level flaws we discussed earlier, like buffer overflows. The tools themselves need to help build security in.
They absolutely do. And two critical features, which are pretty standard now but need to be consistently enabled and enforced across your entire build and deployment environment, are ASLR and the non-executable stack, NX.
Right, ASLR address space layout randomization. I remember that causing a lot of headaches for exploit developers when it first came out.
It still does, to some extent. It's a foundational defense. ASLR works by dynamically randomizing the memory addresses where key parts of a program are loaded each time it runs things like the program's code itself, libraries it uses, the stack, the heap.
So the attacker can't just hard-code memory addresses in their exploit anymore.
Exactly. If the location of the stack or a critical library function changes every time the program starts, the attacker can't reliably predict where to jump to overwrite a return address, or where their injected shellcode might end up. It breaks the reliability of many common exploitation techniques, making the attacker's job significantly harder.
But ASLR isn't foolproof, is it? I seem to recall attackers finding ways around it.
Oh, absolutely not foolproof. It's a crucial layer, a defense in-depth measure, but it's not a magic bullet. Attackers adapted. The main bypass involves finding a separate information leak vulnerability.
Like being able to read a tiny bit of the program's memory.
Right. If an attacker can leak just one valid memory address from within a randomized region, like the address of a function in a loaded library, they can often calculate the random offset that ASLR applied for that run. Once they know the offset, they can adjust all the addresses in their exploit accordingly, effectively defeating ASLR for that process.
So it makes things harder, but not impossible if there's another flaw.
Correct. Which is why we also rely heavily on the non-executable stack, or the NX bit. You might also hear it called DEP, Data Execution Prevention, on Windows.
And this directly targets stack smashing.
It's a direct mitigation. It's a hardware feature supported by modern processors, working together with the operating system. It allows the OS to mark specific regions of memory, most importantly the stack, as non-executable.
Meaning the CPU simply won't run any code it finds there.
Exactly. So if an attacker successfully performs a stack buffer overflow and writes their shellcode onto the stack, when they try to jump to it by overwriting the return address, the processor sees the NX bit is set for that memory region and just refuses to execute the instructions. It typically results in the program crashing safely rather than executing the attacker's malicious code.
Okay, that sounds pretty effective against the classic stack smash. But again, attackers adapt, right? This led to techniques like return-oriented programming, ROP.
Precisely. Attackers are clever. Since they couldn't execute their own code directly from the stack anymore, they figured out how to achieve their goals by reusing small pieces of legitimate code that are already present in the program's memory space, in the main program or loaded libraries, code which is marked as executable.
How does that work?
They hunt for tiny sequences of existing machine instructions called gadgets that happen to perform a useful small action, like loading a value into a register, and, crucially, end with a return instruction.
Okay.
Then, instead of putting shellcode on the stack, the attacker carefully places a chain of addresses onto the stack, where each address points to one of these useful gadgets. When the function returns, it pops the first gadget address off the stack and jumps to it. The gadget executes its small instruction, then hits its read, which pops the next gadget address off the stack, and so on.
So they chain together these tiny bits of legitimate code to get the effect they want.
Exactly. They build complex operations, potentially achieving the same result as running shellcode, but without ever injecting or executing a single byte of their own code from a non-executable region. It's like making a ransom note out of letters cut from a magazine. This is why the defense has to be layered. ASLR makes finding the gadgets harder, NX stops direct code injection, and mitigating ROP requires even more advanced defenses like control flow integrity, CFI, which is a whole other topic. But it shows the constant arms race.
It really does. Okay, so moving up from the compiler and OS level to operational security. Our sources really hammered home the importance of locking down the actual infrastructure where software is built and deployed, the CI/CD pipeline itself. If the build server gets compromised, all that fancy code signing we talked about could be bypassed or subverted, right?
Absolutely. This brings us right back full circle to the lessons from Solar Sunrise. Granular access controls and rigorous secrets management across the entire CI/CD pipeline are completely non-negotiable.
Meaning not everyone gets admin access to everything.
Not even close. Every tool, every automated process, every user, every service account involved in building, testing, storing artifacts, or deploying code should operate under the principle of least privilege. If a script's only job is to deploy a web configuration to the staging environment, it should only have credentials and permissions to do that, and nothing else. It shouldn't be able to read the database passwords for production or access the code signing keys.
Makes sense. Compartmentalize the risk.
Exactly. And one of the most intriguing points raised in the material was about controlling the automation itself.
Hmm?
We rely on automation in CI/CD to be fast and efficient, but that speed can be a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, a mistake in an automation script, or worse, a malicious change injected into one, can propagate incredibly rapidly across many systems. Automation can make massive, damaging changes at machine speed, potentially unsupervised.
So how do you guard against runaway automation?
The suggestion was quite clever. You don't let automation make unsupervised policy changes or deployments of large magnitude or scope indefinitely. You implement a change budget.
A budget for changes.
Yeah, think of it like this. An automated deployment system is allowed to execute its tasks, maybe make up to, say, 5 significant configuration changes or deploy to 5 servers. But once it hits that predefined budget limit, it stops. It requires human intervention.
A human has to review what happened and approve more budget.
Exactly. A human operator needs to assess the changes made so far, check for unexpected outcomes or signs of trouble, and then manually authorize the automation to continue, perhaps resetting or increasing its budget. It acts as a crucial circuit breaker, preventing a single flawed or malicious automation run from causing a widespread catastrophic failure across the entire infrastructure. It puts a human check back into the high-speed loop.
That's a really interesting control mechanism. Okay, finally, even with all this crypto, SBOMs, ASLR, NX least privilege, change budgets, things can still go wrong. An attacker might find a new way in. What about the response side? How do we make sure recovery is fast and effective when an incident does happen?
This is where planning needs to shift from just high-level strategy documents to concrete, actionable procedures. The sources emphasize the need for detailed playbooks to complement the overall incident response plan.
Not just what we'll do, but exactly how we'll do it.
Precisely. These playbooks shouldn't be vague. They need to list specific, step-by-step instructions for responders to follow during a crisis. Things like the exact command sequence to safely grant temporary emergency administrative access to a specific system, the precise tools and commands to use to dump and parse these particular logs for forensic analysis of a suspected web server compromise, the validated, ordered steps for failing over production traffic from System A to System B.
So it removes guesswork under pressure.
It replaces high-pressure, adrenaline-fueled, potentially error-prone decision-making with established, pre-approved, frequently rehearsed, and validated procedures. These playbooks often need to be very specific to teams or technologies. They are the organizational structure, the muscle memory that needs to be built around all the technical defenses we've discussed. Without them, even the best technical controls might not save you when things truly hit the fan. #tag outro.
Wow, okay. That was definitely a deep dive. We really covered a lot of ground there. We started by mapping out the almost chaotic world of physical software flaws, things like the classic buffer overflow leading to an attacker getting a shell.
Right, the low-level memory corruption issues.
And we ended up in the highly structured, mathematically rigorous world of cryptography, architectural controls, and operational procedures needed to actually manage that risk in the modern software supply chain.
Yeah, it's quite the journey from exploit development to cryptographic proofs. And the foundational takeaway, I think, is that securing the supply chain really boils down to enforcing cryptographic integrity and verified identity at every single critical stage.
Using those strong hashes, the digital signatures backed by protected keys, maybe those transparency logs.
Exactly. Using high-bit hashes and transparency logs to prove nothing's been tampered with, using digital signatures secured by HSMs to prove verified authorship and enable things like binary authorization. What we're fundamentally trying to do is overcome inherent human fallibility mistakes, oversight, the sheer overwhelming volume of code and alerts by substituting it where possible with mathematical certainty.
So striving for this future where every artifact is signed, every deployment is authorized based on policy, every environment is hardened with defenses like ASLR and NX, and automation is kept in check with things like that change budget idea. The ultimate goal is trust, but trust guaranteed by math and process, not just by hoping for the best or relying solely on human review.
Which I think leads us nicely to the final provocative thought we want to leave you, the listener, with. If cryptography can provide that mathematical proof of integrity, if we can get to a state of near-perfect verification that a piece of code is untampered and genuinely originates from a trusted, verified source, what are the remaining process gaps? What human factors or organizational complexities or maybe overlooked assumptions still constitute an unverifiable vulnerability in your organization's own trust pipeline, regardless of how technically robust the cryptographic controls might seem on paper?
So even with perfect math, where can the process still break down?
Exactly. The true ongoing challenge of securing the software supply chain might not be inventing a better hash algorithm or a fancier signature scheme. It might be achieving the near-perfect operational discipline required to apply that cryptographic integrity flawlessly, consistently, across thousands of developers, dozens of complex environments, millions of third-party dependencies, and constantly evolving tooling. That organizational challenge, that potential gap between theory and perfect implementation that's likely where the sophisticated attacker will still look for their advantage, that's the human element cryptography can't entirely eliminate.